Greetings, friends. As many of you know, among the curious reports filling the news cycles lately, we had, for instance, Senator Marco Rubio, who chairs the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, who told CBS News that he hopes that the advanced UFOs that have been being filmed in our atmosphere in recent years, doing things that seem beyond our understanding of physics or technology. He says he hopes those are Chinese or Russian or some other adversary who has perhaps made some sort of technological leap that allows them to conduct the sort of activity that, frankly, we don't comprehend, we can't understand, because he says the alternative, that these might be alien craft, would bother him a great deal more than if it is one of our competitors on the international field. Now, on the heels of his testimony, the New York Times cited Harry Reid, the former Nevada senator who was instrumental in funding the original UFO program, saying that he believes that, quote, crashes of objects of unknown origin may have occurred, and that retrieved materials from, quote, not of this world are now in our possession and under top secret study, end quote. Of course, some of you know this was partly behind the investigation that I conducted some years ago that led to the book by me and my co-author, Chris Putnam. The book was called Exo-Vaticana. And as part of that project, Chris and I and my son, Joe Ardis, wound up literally on the top of Mount Graham in Arizona, where we visited the Large Binocular Telescope, the Radio Telescope, and the Vatican's Advanced Technology Telescope, where the Jesuit father who was on duty that day, by the way, who we got on film, and we have not released that film yet, told us that among the most important research occurring with that site's Vatican astronomers nowadays is the search for extrasolar planets, and actually monitoring exo-worlds on which they believe there might be advanced alien intelligence. That's what he actually told us. He then proceeded, as did our guide that day, to show us all around that observatory from the personal quarters of the church's astronomers, where they ate, slept, relaxed, studied, really modest accommodations. From there to the control rooms, the computer screens, the systems, even the telescope itself, which they allowed us to unchain the security chains around it and go up, basically climb around on the contraption. Now, while we were given complete and unrestricted opportunity to question how the devices there are being used and what distinctively sets each of the telescopes on Mount Graham apart, there were a few things that we had not expected to see. For instance, the ease with which the astronomers and the technicians also spoke of UFOs, and they meant unidentified flying objects of the alien nature. Now, that was especially true when we walked up the gravel road from the Vatican's Advanced Technology Telescope to the Large Binocular Telescope, the LBT, where we actually spent most of the day with a systems engineer who not only took us to all 7 levels of that mighty machine, but he also pointed out the Lucifer device, which he lovingly referred to a couple of times as Lucy and elsewhere as Lucifer. And actually, if you go back and watch the trailer for that book, Exo-Vaticana, we actually have film of him up on the top. I think we were 7 levels up, pointing with a laser down to the device in the middle of those big twin mirrors and literally saying, this is the Lucifer device. And then, of course, he explained to us that day, and we go into in it in the book, what it's used for, as well as every other aspect of the telescope that we tried to wrap our minds around that day. But that same technician, he stunned us when we sat down in the control room, listening to him and the other astronomers that were sitting in there speak so casually of the redundancy with which UFOs are actually captured on screens, darting through the heavens, sometimes in the deepest part of space. He actually told us that there are times when they have to wait for armadas of whatever these things are to get out of the way so that they can look past them at whatever deep space, planetoid, moon, object, whatever it is that they want to study on any particular day. He literally didn't blink an eye, and neither did any of the other scientists in that room. And we were shocked at that, how ordinary it seemed to be for them on the top of Mount Graham to talk about UFOs. As much as the commonality of UFO sightings on Mount Graham's telescopes intrigued us, that was not the primary reason for our being there. We had actually gone to Mount Graham with deeper questions concerning high-level Vatican astronomers and what they had been leaking to and discussing with the media in recent years, including captivating comments from people like Jesuit priest Guy Consolmagno, who's a leading astronomer, who often turns up as a spokesman for the Vatican at universities and different places where he provides lectures. He's worked at NASA and taught at Harvard, at MIT. He currently splits his time between the Vatican Observatory and Laboratory, the Scuola Vaticana, which is headquartered at the summer residence of the Pope in Castel Gandolfo, Italy. And he splits his time between there and Mount Graham in Arizona, where we had gone. Over the last few years, Consolmagno has focused so much time and effort in an attempt to reconcile science and religion in public forums, specifically as it relates to the subject of extraterrestrial life and its potential impact on the future of faith, that when we were doing our initial investigation, I decided to reach out to him, to contact him. He surprised me. He agreed to be interviewed via the internet from Rome. But it seemed that once he knew who I was and what I was really wanting to examine, all of a sudden his answers kind of got short, if not altogether evasive. Now, on the upside, he was gracious enough to send me a copy of the private PDF, his own personal PDF, for a booklet that he had authored entitled Intelligent Life in the Universe, Catholic Belief, and the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligent Life, which had been pulled by the publisher shortly after it was authorized by Rome back in 2005. And today that book is no longer officially available anywhere. In fact, it's interesting because it was Steve Quayle and I that were doing some shows back in 2005. And I had told him, this book's coming out. I can't wait to get a copy of it. It promises to provide some of the answers about where the Vatican and some of their leaders, some of their theologians, where they are coming from with all their commentary about, the aliens being our brothers, and they would be willing to baptize aliens, and all this curious conversation that was going on back then. And so I ordered the book. I waited, never got the book. Finally contacted the publisher and found out that it had almost immediately been pulled and that the Vatican was no longer going to make it available. So it was all highly curious. I really didn't get that. So when I asked Consolmagno a few years ago if there was any way I could get a copy of that book, I was surprised when he sent me his own personal PDF. And let me say, it is a gold mine of what he and the Vatican are considering regarding the ramifications of astrobiology, and specifically the disclosure of advanced extraterrestrial life. And perhaps that's the reason why it was pulled, because of some of the combinations, the connections that he makes in that booklet that are eye-opening. In it, for instance, he admits how contemporary societies will, quote, look to the aliens to be the saviors of humankind, end quote, to illustrate the theological soundness of that possibility. Consul Magno argues that humans are not the only intelligent beings God created in the universe, and that these non-human life forms are described in the Bible, according to him. Now, you should know, disclosure here, that after I published parts of his material during the time we were promoting the book Exo Vaticana, which, thank you very much, became an international bestseller, but after I disclosed part of what he had said in his unpublished book, he went on the Vatican Observatory website and he denied that he had written or said any of what I had quoted. And so I was glad that in the book Exo Vaticana, the only quotes of him I make did not come from our private email exchanges, but rather come directly out of his booklet, which I still have and which I can and do make available to people who request it so they can read it for themselves. And in fact, after he denied having said any of that, that's what I started doing, making it available to whoever wanted it free so that they could read it for themselves. In his booklet, he starts by pointing to angels as other non-human intelligence, but then he surprises by making some very strange connections to the Nephilim, the spirits, these illegal offspring, if you will, of the fallen watchers. And here's what he says, quote, "Other heavenly beings come up several times in the Psalms. For example, looking at the beautiful passage in Psalm 89 that calls out, 'Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord?'" Sounds fine so far, right? But then he goes on, "The heavens are yours, the earth also is yours, the world and all that is in it, you have founded them. Likewise," I'm quoting here, "God asked Job 38:7, if any human can claim to have been around at the creation when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy." And then he asks the question, are these heavens, these holy ones, those in the sky, the morning stars and heavenly beings, more references to angels, or do they refer to some other kind of life beyond our knowledge? And, he says, these are not the only non-human intelligent creatures mentioned in the Bible. Here's where it gets interesting. Quote, "There's that odd and mysterious passage at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6 that describes the sons of God taking human wives. With it is a frustratingly oblique reference to the Nephilim, the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. Most biblical scholars," he says, "suggest that the Nephilim and the sons of God in Genesis can be explained away as a leftover reference to the creation stories of the pagans who surrounded ancient Israel, that they were written by the kind of people whose culture saw anyone not of my tribe," see what he's doing here? Continue quote, "as being unmistakably alien. Likewise, the reference to heavens and stars singing and praising the Lord can be seen simply for the beautiful poetry that it is. But whether you interpret these creatures as angels or aliens doesn't really matter for the sake of our argument here. The point is that the ancient writers of the Bible, like all ancient peoples, were perfectly happy with the possibility that other intelligent beings could exist," end quote. Now think about what I just quoted from Consul Magno there, and then ask yourself the question, did the Vatican's top astronomer actually mean to use the story of the Nephilim from the Bible as an example of the kind of space saviors that he refers to earlier, that man may soon look to for salvation? That incredible assertion is only topped by what he then says next. In quoting John 10:16, which says, "And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and they shall be one fold and one shepherd," end quote. Cosmo Magno writes this about that, quote, perhaps it's not so far-fetched to see the second person of the Trinity, the Word, who was present in the beginning, John 1:1, coming to lay down his life and take it up again, John 10:18, not only as the Son of Man, but also as a child of other races, end quote. Think about that. So when I read that in his book, I immediately emailed Consolmagno and asked the question, do Vatican scholars actually believe that Jesus might have been the star child of an alien race? Do you and other Jesuits secretly hold that the virgin birth was in reality an abduction scenario in which Mary was impregnated by E.T., giving birth to the hybrid Jesus? And by the way, with that, the interviews ceased. But all of that would seem impossible theology, wouldn't it? If not for the fact that other high-ranking Vatican spokespersons, those who routinely study from the star base, Mount Graham, as local Indians call it, have been saying the same in recent years. That includes, well, their highest spokespersons, Dr. Christopher Corbally, Vice Director for the Vatican Observatory Research Group on Mount Graham until 2012, who believes, by the way, that our image of God, our ideas about God, is going to have to change if evidence of alien life is confirmed by scientists, including the need to evolve from the concept of an anthropocentric God into what he calls a, quote, broader entity. And then there's the former Vatican Observatory Director, Father Jose Funes, who actually went equally far, suggesting that alien life not only exists in the universe and is our brother, but will, if discovered, confirm the true faith of Christianity, their words, not mine, and the dominion of Rome, he said. Now, when the El Observatorio Romano newspaper, which only publishes what the Vatican approves and is owned by them, when they ask what he meant by that, he replied, "How can we rule out that life may have developed elsewhere? Just as we consider earthly creatures as a brother and sister, why should we not talk about an extraterrestrial brother? It would still be part of creation. And believing in the existence of such is not contradictory to Catholic doctrine," end quote. So those statements and others are really but some of the latest in a string of comments by numerous Vatican astronomers confirming a growing belief, or is it what they think is inside knowledge, that discovery may be made in the near future of alien life, including intelligent life, advanced extraterrestrial intelligence, and that this disclosure, this encounter, is not going to challenge the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And I won't go into it here, but how could they possibly know that? What would give the Roman Catholic authorities the idea that if aliens suddenly invade planet Earth, the one religious organization that will not be challenged by it is going to be the Roman Catholic Church? It almost sounds like a deal with the devil's already been made, a Faustian bargain, a Mephistophelian bargain with what they believe to be higher entities, higher intelligence. From the 1970s through the 90s, however, it was Monsignor Corrado Balducci, an exorcist, a theologian, a member of the Vatican Curia, that is the governing body at Rome, a friend of the Pope, who went perhaps furthest and started appearing on all these national television programs, Italian programs mostly, but was also in a documentary film that was made here in the United States. And what he was doing was he was stating that extraterrestrials were not only possible, But according to him, they were already interacting with Earth, and that the Vatican leaders were aware of it. Now keep in mind, he was the sanctioned spokesperson for the Vatican on the subject of ETs. So speaking as an official etiologist, is that a word? Demonologist, he wanted the world to know that extraterrestrial encounters, he says, are not demonic. They are not due to psychological impairment. And they are not a case of what he called entity attachment. But these encounters, he said, deserve to be studied carefully and to be believed, accepted as fact. He even disclosed how the Vatican itself has been closely following the phenomenon and actually quietly compiling material evidence from Vatican embassies around the world on the extraterrestrials and their mission. For example, at a forum concerning the enormous UFO flap in Mexico back then, he stated, quote, "I always wished to be the spokesman for these star peoples who also are part of God's glory, and I will continue to bring it to the attention of the Holy Mother Church," end quote. Now, whatever you make of his claims, Balducci was a member of a special group of consultants to the Vatican, a public spokesperson for Rome on the matter of extraterrestrial life, as well as UFOs and abduction phenomenon. And his assertions have never been contradicted by the Roman Catholic Church. Now, perhaps most intriguing of all of these spokespersons was Catholic theologian Father Malachi Martin, who I've often quoted, who before his death in 1999 hinted at something like imminent extraterrestrial contact more than once. Some of you may know, while he was on Coast to Coast AM radio in 1997, Art Bell asked Malachi why the Vatican was so heavily invested in the study of deep space and involved with the building of the Mount Graham Observatory, which me, Chris Putnam, and Joe Ardis visited. That's important because as a retired professor of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, Malachi Martin, well, he was a polymath. He could speak, I forget, over a dozen languages. He worked inside the Vatican on some of their most top secret projects. He had access to secret files, the Third Secret of Fatima. He worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls, translating those for the Vatican, all these highly placed things. He was uniquely qualified to hold secret information, therefore, also pertaining to the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. And his answer to Art Bell ignited a firestorm of interest among Christians and secular ufologists when he answered Art by saying, well, the reason the Vatican's on top of Mount Graham is because the mentality amongst those who are at the highest levels of Vatican administration and geopolitics know what's going on in space and what's approaching us, and that it could be of the greatest importance within the next decade. Now, those cryptic words, what's approaching us, could be of the greatest importance. They were followed in these subsequent interviews with Father Malachi, with discussions of what he called a mysterious sign in the sky that he believed was approaching the earth from the north. While that could have been an oblique reference to an end-time Catholic prophecy, the so-called Great Comet, people familiar with Malachi believe that he may have been referring to a near-future arrival of alien intelligence. And yet, if ET life is something that Vatican officials have privately considered for some time, why start speaking of it so openly now in what some people perceive as a kind of careful doctrinal unveiling, a slow disclosure over the last few years? Even Pope Francis has weighed in on the aliens, saying that they would be our brothers and that he would be willing to baptize them as such. Is all of this a deliberate effort by church officials to warm up the laity to a coming ET disclosure moment? Are official church publications on the subject an attempt to soften the blow before disclosure arrives in order to help the faithful retain their orthodoxy in light of unprecedented forthcoming knowledge? Well, Guy Consolmagno, again, who I interviewed several times, some time back was also interviewed by the Sunday Herald. And in that article, he pointed out how his job included reconciling, quote, the wildest reaches of science fiction with the flint-eyed dogma of the Holy See, end quote, and that his latest mental meander was about something he called the Jesus seed, which he described as a brain-warping theory, which speculates that perhaps every planet that harbors intelligent, self-aware life may have also had a Christ walk across its methane seas, just as Jesus did here on earth in Galilee. That sounds a little bit like a sanctified version of panspermia, doesn't it? The idea that life on earth was seeded by something a long time ago, maybe brought here by an asteroid impact. But in this case, the seed that Consolmagno described was divinely appointed and reconciled somehow to Jesus Christ. So there's a curious connection between these Vatican spokespersons and the question of extraterrestrials and salvation that was further hinted at back in May of 2008, once again in the El Observatore Romano. And this was an interview with Father Funes in an article titled, "The Extraterrestrial is My Brother," which you can still Google and read online. But in the English translation of the Italian feature, Funes responds to the question of whether extraterrestrials would need to be redeemed, which he believes should not be assumed. Quote, God was made man in Jesus to save us, he says. If other intelligent beings exist, it is not said that they would have need of redemption. They could remain in full friendship with their Creator. Aha! This is where stuff starts getting interesting, as they say, because by full friendship, Funes is reflecting how some Vatican theologians now believe the possibility that extraterrestrial species may exist that are morally superior to men. In other words, closer to God than we fallen humans are, and that as a consequence, they may be coming here to evangelize us and not the other way around. Father Guy Consolmagno took up that same line of thinking when he wrote in his book, Brother Astronomer, Adventures of a Vatican Scientist, this, quote, "So the question of whether or not one should evangelize is really a moot point. Any alien we find will learn and change from contact with us, just as we will learn and change from contact with them. It's inevitable. They will be evangelizing us," he says. This disturbing rabbit hole goes much deeper. In a paper for the Interdisciplinary Encyclopedia of Religion and Science website, Father Giuseppe Tanzella-Nitti, who's an Opus Dei level theologian of the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, the Vatican's university, and a man who is working on a theological position that is working its way slowly through Vatican academia to see if it can be accepted as official church policy or doctrine. He explains just how we could actually be evangelized during contact with spiritual aliens, as he refers to them, as every believer in God, he argues, would greet the extraterrestrial civilization as an extraordinary experience and would be inclined to respect the alien and recognize the common origin of our different species as being from the same creator. According to Giuseppe, this contact by non-terrestrial intelligence would then offer possibilities of, quote, better understanding the relationship between God and the whole of creation, end quote. Giuseppe then goes on to state, this might not immediately oblige Christians here on earth to, quote, renounce their own faith in God simply on the basis of the reception of new, unexpected information of a religious character from extraterrestrial civilizations, end quote, but that such a renunciation, you need to comprehend this, such a renunciation could come soon after as the new religious content originating from outside the earth is confirmed as reasonable and credible. I'm not sure how we would go about confirming that an extraterrestrial gospel is reasonable and credible. But having said that, he goes on, quote, once the trustworthiness of the information has been verified, the believer would have to reconcile such new information with the truth that he or she already knows and believes on the basis of the revelation of the one and triune God, conducting a rereading of the gospel inclusive of the new data, end quote. Again, how this more complete ET gospel might de-emphasize or significantly modify our understanding of salvation through Jesus Christ is mind-boggling, but it don't stop there. It's also discussed by former Vatican Observatory Director Christopher Corbally in his article, What If There Were Other Inhabited Worlds?, in which he concludes that Jesus simply might not remain the only word of salvation. Let me quote him, quote, I would try to explore the alien by letting it be what it is without rushing for a classification category, not even presuming two genders, Corbally said, before dropping this bombshell, quote, while Christ is the first and the last word, the Alpha and Omega, spoken to humanity, he is not necessarily the only word spoke to the universe. For the word spoken to us does not seem to exclude an equivalent word spoken to aliens. They, too, could have had their Logos event, whatever that event might have been. It does not have to be a repeated death and resurrection if we allow God more imagination than some religious thinkers seem to have had. For God, as omnipotent, is not restricted to one form of language, the human, end quote. So folks, there it is, that high-ranking spokespersons for the Vatican have in recent years increasingly offered language acknowledging the likelihood of extraterrestrial intelligence and the dramatic roles that ET's introduction to human civilization could soon play in regard to altering established creeds about anthropology, philosophy, religion, and redemption may become more future consequential than most people are prepared for, and maybe sooner than most people prepared for. And then there is that Lucifer device at Mount Graham, which is curiously described on the Vatican Observatory website as, quote, NASA and the Vatican's infrared telescope called Lucifer, a German-built, NASA and the Vatican-owned and funded infrared telescope for looking at, now they may have removed this, but you can go back in Time Machine and look it up in the caches on the internet. This was on their website for looking at Nibiru and Nemesis. Now, why has the Vatican Observatory website, at least until now, allowed that caption to remain online last I checked? Nibiru and Nemesis are what some people believe to be hypothetical planets that supposedly return in orbit close to the Earth after very long periods of time. They've been connected in modern myth with Planet X, and most darkly with the destruction of planets that some people believe occurred during a great war between God and Lucifer, when the powerful angel was cast out of heaven. Are Rome and other world powers using the Lucifer device to study something, to monitor something that the rest of us cannot see, something that they believe represents maybe this ancient war, some connection there, or worse, keeping an eye on approaching end times angelic transportation devices or UFOs, something that Father Malachi Martin hinted at? The latter theory is interesting in light of the demonic name of the infrared device, Lucifer. But it's also interesting in that infrared telescopes can detect objects that are too cool or far away and faint to be observed in visible light, such as distant planets, some nebulae, brown dwarf stars. Additionally, infrared radiation has longer wavelengths than visible light, which means that it can pass through astronomical gas and dust without being scattered. Objects and areas, for instance, obscured from view in the visible spectrum, including the center of the Milky Way, can therefore be observed by Lucifer's infrared technology. And another thing that UFO researchers have fascinated about for some time now, and that was explained to me and my team while we were at Mount Graham, is how infrared technology can also be used to spot and track UFOs, unidentified flying objects that otherwise cannot be seen with other kinds of telescopes or the naked eye. In fact, you can do this for yourself. Some of the most astonishing UFOs ever caught on film have been recorded with infrared. And you can go to YouTube and places like that and look up infrared UFOs. Some of the video is shocking, and some of them have done side by side. Infrared telescope, non-infrared telescope, where one sees nothing and the other is filming some of the most bizarre, strange deep space activity. But back to my bigger question. Why the Vatican has taken this carefully designed, deliberate course over the last few years to prep their theology, to prep religious individuals for the idea that we might have to tinker with our doctrine, our ideas of Christology, our ideas of the triune Godhead, salvation. Why they've been on this course is a mystery. And it seems to imply knowledge on their part of facts that are yet hidden to most of the world that could hold far-reaching historic implications. It also illustrates how Rome has wittingly or unwittingly set itself up to become the agent of what I believe to be mass end times deception regarding salvation from above. That's because historically there exists this clear pattern wherein man's psychological need of a savior is displaced during times of distress, times like today, when people may start looking skyward for divine intervention. As Dr. Ted Peters, professor of systematic theology at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, wrote a while back, quote, "With the constant threat of destruction in the post-World War II era, leaving our planet in a state of insecurity and anxiety, it is no wonder many have begun to hope for a Messiah to save us." the holiness of the sky and the need for a salvation converge and blend when the bright, clean, powerful UFO zooms up onto the horizon. Could it be our celestial Savior has arrived, end quote? Jesuit Brother Guy Consolmagno must think so, as he assured us that if highly advanced ET saviors from outer space touch down on planet Earth soon, it is not going to mean what Catholics believe is wrong. It's going to mean what non-Catholics believe is not quite right. Quote, we're going to find out that everything is truer in ways we couldn't have even yet imagined, end quote, says Consolmagno. But in truth, Consolmagno's advice for the religious faithful could be leading mankind into a gigantic setup, as many religions have at least one apocalyptic myth describing the end of the world accompanied by a redeemer who appears in the sky at the last minute to rescue the chosen from annihilation or wrath. Mayans, Assyrians, Egyptians, Greeks, many others held similar beliefs. In more modern times, the Hopi Indians foresee times of great hardship when they're going to be preserved by the power of a blue star, far off and invisible, that suddenly makes its appearance in the heavens. Today, even factions of the New Age look for this techno-savior to arrive in the atmosphere in the nick of time to save mankind. Although Jesus himself is prophesied to appear in the clouds during an era of great earthly trials, according to 1 Thessalonians 4, 16 through 18, predominant among prophecy scholars is the idea that, coupled with any heavenly appearing and concurrent salvation of believers from chaos, will first be the materialization of a false Christ, the man of sin. So where Hopi see a blue star and Vatican astronomers see their space brothers en route to guide us all into the light, evangelical Christians and Protestants understand that the Antichrist will initially assume the role of a fabricated end times Messiah who mimics the return of Christ with a false second coming that also happens to be attended by heavenly, quote, signs and wonders, 2 Thessalonians 2, 8 through 9. Could these deceptive wonders be, number one, the discovery of artificial structures on another world? Two, a contact scenario? Or three, maybe even something more dramatic, like a flying saucer armada piloted by creatures who appear to be advanced humanoids, but who are in fact evil supernaturalism on a quest to mislead and destroy the human race. Even secular ufologists suspect demonic activity in the interaction between humans and so-called aliens. For instance, Whitley Strieber, the New Age author of Communion and other books on the subject, once wrote, quote, "There are worse things than death, I suspected, and I was beginning to get the distinct impression that one of them had taken an interest in me. So far, the word demon had never been spoken among the scientists and doctors who were working with me, and why should it have been? We were beyond such things. We were a group of atheists and agnostics, far too sophisticated to be concerned with such archaic ideas as demons and angels," end quote. He wrote that in his book Communion when he claimed that he was being regularly visited by aliens. In 1958, a peculiar novel was published under the title A Case of Conscience by James Blish. In the story, a Jesuit priest named Father Ruiz Sanchez and a team of scientists, they travel to a newly discovered planet dubbed in the book Lithia. They go there to study the Lithians who live there. Now, unknown to the science team, the Vatican secretly advises the Catholic Father to investigate whether the aliens have redeemable souls. But what he finds in the Lithians are intelligent creatures whose morality fits perfectly with Christianity, but who seem to be devoid of any concept of religion or God. And so his dilemma grows. And soon he is invited to visit with a Lithian family. And he writes this, quote, "Here was the first chance, at long last, to see something of the private life of Lithia, and through that, perhaps, to gain some inkling of the moral life, the role in which God had cast the Lithians in the ancient drama of good and evil, in the past and in the times to come. Until that was known, the Lithians in their Eden might be only spuriously good, all reason, all organic thinking machines, Ultimax, with tails but without souls," end quote. Now, I'm not going to spoil the ending of that book for you, but it does include the Jesuits, described as the cerebral cortex of the church, dealing with these knotty moral, theological, and organizational issues surrounding a papal proclamation back on earth and the seed of Satan. Probably got your attention now, right? So read the novel. You'll get the whole picture. But it's important to note that the fictional Father Ruiz Sanchez warns the Vatican to classify Lithia as X1, meaning a planet to be forever quarantined from Earth and humans due to its potential for great deception. Let me quote again. "What we have here on Lithia is very clear indeed," he wrote. "We have, and now I'm prepared to be blunt, a planet and a people propped up by the ultimate enemy. It is a gigantic trap prepared for all of us, for every man on earth and off of it. We can do nothing with it but reject it, nothing but say to it, retro me Satanas. If we compromise with it in any way, we are damned," end quote. Now, when Ruiz Sanchez uses the phrase retro me Satanas, he is enunciating the medieval Catholic formula for exorcism, vade retro Satanas, or go back Satan, a clear reckoning that the aliens on Lithia are part of a satanic plot to be avoided at all cost, an astro-theological conspiracy designed to mislead mankind at some point in the future. Now, in the book, he eventually convinces the Pope, Pope Hadrian, in the novel, of the satanic stratagem, but ironically, he's unable to convince all of the church's theologians. Now, did the author of A Case of Conscience, did he foresee how such great deception would eventually be embraced by the Vatican and its leadership, its scholars, its theologians, as a result of some of Rome's celebrated scholars and astronomers? When science fiction writer Joe Walton asked real-life Jesuit Brother Guy Consolmagno, who I interviewed from Rome, what he made of these issues posed by Blish in his novel, Consolmagno admitted that the Jesuits are the strongest advocates of enculturation, basically allowing alien cultures to maintain their paganism while modifying expressions of Christian ideas within those beliefs. And secondly, accepting of alien cultures for who they are. And thirdly, willing to adapt alien religious practices into a form and a language that can be accepted. So, if Brother Consolmagno had been on Lithia, Walton concluded, we'd already be in contact with aliens and finding out as much as we could about them. Now, from what I've seen, Walton may not have to wait much longer for contact. which raises a kind of hidden aspect of A Case of Conscience, the novel, involving wordplay around the term Lithia. While Blish makes an obvious connection to the name of the planet and its inhabitants as reflecting the abundance of lithium ore on the alien world, or that could be mined and exploded for use in making nuclear weapons, mention of the goddess Ilithia is strangely missing from his work. And that stood out to me as kind of a secret code, if you will. I wrote about it in Exo Vaticana. A secret code in Blish's book that specifically relates to the deductions of Father Ruiz Sanchez and the, quote, seed of Satan being debated by the church back on earth, according to that storyline. If the similarity between Lithia and the goddess Ilithia is coincidental, then it's extraordinary, and I don't buy it, as it was the job of this goddess in antiquity to protect the very seed of the serpent that in turn generates the birth of the serpent child and future serpent savior. In fact, so important was the goddess Ilithia's role in ancient days as the preserver of this serpent seed toward the birth of the serpent savior that shrines were erected to her by cult followers across Greece, including at Athens, Megara, Corinthos, Argos, Mycene, Sparta, and other places, in which terracotta figures of immortal nurses were depicted watching over the divine children in whom the bloodline would survive. For example, on the mainland at Olympia, there's a shrine dedicated to Ilithia that was witnessed by a traveler and second century geographer Pausanias, in which a small inner chamber sacred to the serpent savior hosted a virgin priestess who cared for a serpent that was fed on honey-laid barley cakes and water. The shrine memorialized the appearance of a Marian-like woman with a babe in her arms who, quote, at a crucial moment when Ilians were threatened by forces from Arcadia, was placed on the ground between the contending forces and changed into a terrifying serpent, driving the Arcadians away in flight before it disappeared into the hill, end quote. Interestingly, the myth of Ilithia is also connected in ancient history with the birth of Apollo, whose coming as the promised seed formed the Novus Ordo Seclorum prophecy on the Great Seal of the United States. This Messiah who returns to rule the earth in the latter days is also described by the same name in the book of 2 Thessalonians as the Antichrist, who becomes the progeny or incarnation of the ancient serpent seed, the seed of Apollo. The warning in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 says, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. And the Greek word there is apoleia, or apollyon, Apollo. Revelation 17:8 also directly ties the coming of Antichrist with the serpent seed of Apollo, revealing that the beast will ascend from the bottomless pit and enter into him. The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, apoleia, Apollo. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. Now these verses elucidate a very important central eschatological issue, end times issue, concerning how all of the Bible is really a story about the ancient and future struggle between the seed of the woman, Jesus, and that of the serpent. Genesis 3:15 says, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed And the word seed there is zera, meaning offspring, descendants, children, and her seed. Besides the pre-preaching of the gospel of Christ in that verse, which is known in theology as the proto-evangelium, another incredible tenet emerges here, and that is this, that Satan has seed, and it is at enmity, hostility, hatred, antagonism with Christ. Now, I believe that an example of Satan's hostile seed can be found in Genesis chapter 6, where fallen angels mingled with humans and produced Nephilim. More importantly, church leaders, including Roman Catholics, from the Middle Ages forward, maybe up until Constantinople arrived to turn the idea on its head, they believed that the Antichrist would be spawned of this demonic seed, which makes it curious how now some of these highest Vatican authorities are contending that the extraterrestrials might actually express the glory of God better than we humans do, even leading mankind to venerate them as gods, a recurrent theme being articulated among numerous Jesuit astronomers. Some we've already mentioned. Other examples include Father Daniel C. Rabel, thought the acceptance of aliens as objects of worship might naturally occur as a result of them having godlike qualities and preternatural gifts ascribed by humans to divinity. Here's what he said, quote, "For example, they," that is the aliens, "might enjoy infused knowledge. They would literally be born with extensive knowledge and would find the acquisition of further knowledge easy and enjoyable. They might be blessed with harmony and concord in the working of their bodily and spiritual faculties. They might be spared the ultimate dissolution of death, passing to their reward at the end of their time of trial as peacefully as the sun sinks below the horizon at the end of the day. They might possess all these preternatural gifts, or only some of them, in any of the various combinations that are limited only by the omnipotence and providence of God." End quote. Father Domenico Grasso, he not only thought such beings would be far ahead of us in science and related fields, but that their version of salvation might be based on a Savior other than Jesus. Even a messianic member of their own race, he said. These beings, he said, closer to God than man, perhaps even unfallen, would possess superior theology that could expand markedly, his word, not mine, our terrestrial understanding of redemption and knowledge of God, something that current Vatican theologians such as Professor of Fundamental Theology Giuseppe Tanzalaniti agreed with, end quote. Another church scholar, Father Thomas F. O'Mara, who was a theologian at the University of Notre Dame, he imagined these godlike beings spread out across the universe on untold planets, called to a special relationship with God, and that it is a mistake, he said, to think that our understanding of covenant, the reign of God, redemption, or shared life exhausts the models by which divine power shares something of its infinite life. Such Catholic leaders believe these spiritually superior aliens may even have been created by God with the future redemption of humanity in mind. Beings who know their place in the eternal scheme of things to evangelize humans when the time is right. Folks, this disturbing and potentially prophetic belief system is partially based on theological arguments made during the 1800s by such men as Monsignor Geraldo di Cancello, the professor of theology at Immaculate Seminary in New Jersey, who believed that the immense distance in intellect between human beings and the angels suggest that God would create intermediate species to fill in the gap, and that these species would be the ETIs, the extraterrestrial intelligence. Monsignor Corrado Balducci, who during his life was the official mouthpiece for the Roman Catholic Church concerning the reality of aliens, agreed with De Concilio, saying, quote, "It is entirely credible that in the enormous distance between angels and humans, there could be found some middle stage, that is, beings with a body like ours, but more elevated spiritually," end quote. Now, when imagining how this issue could finally be settled, Paul Thigpen for the Catholic Answers section of our Sunday Visitor resolved that, quote, "Nothing short of a public, thoroughly documented encounter between earthlings and aliens or their relics will be conclusive," end quote. Interestingly, according to the Quran, the primary religious text of Islam, this encounter may happen sooner than most people suspect and at a specific and hidden time that God himself has already chosen. In Revelation, Rationality, Knowledge, and Truth, Muslim scholar Mirza Tahir Ahmad quotes verse 42:30 of the Quran, which says, "And among his signs is the creation of the heavens and earth, and of whatever living creatures he has spread forth in both. And he has the power to gather them together when he will so please." Ahmad says about this, quote, "Jamahim is the Arabic expression in this verse, which specifically speaks of bringing together all life on earth and life elsewhere. When this meeting of the two will take place is not specified, nor is it mentioned whether it will happen here on earth or elsewhere. One thing, however, is definitely stated. This event will most certainly come to pass whenever God so desires. It should be kept in mind that the word Jama can imply either a physical contact or contact through communication. Only the future will tell how and when this contact will take place, but the very fact that more than 1,400 years ago such a possibility was even predicted is miraculous in itself," end quote. Furthermore, the expectation that aliens are already headed our way, this extends into the non-religious worldview as well. Lewis White Black, a philosopher at the University of Rochester, writes, quote, "I believe even responsible scientific speculation and expensive technology of space exploration in search of other life are the peculiarly modern equivalent of angelology and utopia or demonology and apocalypse," end quote. Black then adds, quote, "Exobiology recapitulates eschatology. The eschatological hope of help from heaven revives when the heavens of modern astronomy replace the heaven of religion. That we can learn from more advanced societies in the skies the secrets of survival is the eschatological hope which motivates, or at least is used to justify, the work of exobiologists," end quote. Of course, all of this applies broadly to other spiritualities as well. For instance, the founder of analytical philosophy and psychology, Carl Jung, wrote concerning ET belief, quote, "In addition to their obviously superior technology, they are credited with the superior wisdom and moral goodness which would, on the other hand, enable them to save humanity," end quote. Speaking of the UFOs as an archetype, Jung described its messianic qualities as creating, quote, "the image of the divine human personality, the primordial man or anthropos, a chin yin or true or whole man, and Elijah who calls down fire from heaven, rises up to heaven in a fiery chariot and is a forerunner of the Messiah, the dogmatized figure of Christ, as well as of Kedir, the verdant one, who is a parallel to Elijah. Like him, he wanders over the earth as a human personification of Allah, end quote. Thus, a belief, folks, in godly aliens that will ultimately come in contact with man, this is something that actually has wide interfaith acceptance among secularists, spiritualists, the world's largest religions, evidently, who seem ready, even excited, about embracing their official disclosure moment, which is something that I believe holds dangerous and deceptive end times ramifications that may manifest sooner than most people imagine. So let me conclude with one final observation. During his lifetime, Sir Arthur C. Clarke was a famous science fiction author, inventor, futurist, and television commentator, who, together with Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov, was considered to be one of the big three of science fiction. Clarke, in particular, had this uncanny knack at foreseeing the future. In fact, in several of his popular novels, he discusses things that only today exist, like iPads and things like that. But unfortunately, that Clarke showed such remarkable prescience may hold important, maybe frightening, realities for our future. This is because in the sci-fi seer's classic Childhood's End, which was written in 1953, giant silver spaceships suddenly appear in the future over every major city on Earth. Now, after the dust settles, the peaceful yet mysterious overlords inside these ships help form a world government, which in the story ends all war, turns the planet into a utopia. Oddly, only a select few people get to see the overlords, and their purpose for coming to Earth remains shrouded as they dodge questions for years, preferring to remain in their spacecrafts, governing by proxy. Overlord Carolyn is the supervisor for Earth, an alien god, who speaks directly only to the UN Secretary General. Carolyn tells him that the overlords will reveal themselves in 50 years, when humanity will have become used to and dependent on their presence. When the revealing finally takes place, at Carolyn's request, two children run into the ship as the crowd below finally gets a glimpse of what the aliens look like. And here's what Clarke wrote in his novel, quote, "There was no mistake. The leathery wings, the little horns, the barbed tail, all were there. The most terrible of all legends had come to life out of the unknown past. Yet now it stood, smiling in ebon majesty, with the sunlight gleaming upon its tremendous body, and with the human child resting trustfully on either arm," end quote. According to the narrative, the revelation of these beings, historically known as the devil and his angels, were in fact always our benefactors, doesn't lead to chaos, but rather to technological and spiritual utopia, quickly resulting in the dissolution of all previously existing religions. And now the world celebrates as people are described as having overcome their prejudices against the devilish sight of Carolyn, or, again, as he had been known in the Bible, Satan. Again, from Clarke's vision, we read, quote, Here was a revelation which no one could doubt or deny. Here, seen by some unknown magic of overlord science, were the true beginnings of all the world's great faiths. Most of them were noble and inspiring, but that was not enough. Within a few days, all mankind's messiahs had lost their divinity. Beneath the fierce and passionless light of truth, faiths that had been sustained millions for twice 1,000 years vanished like morning dew. End quote. Now, as the story continues, the children on earth, set free now from outdated Abrahamic religions like Christianity, begin displaying powerful psychic abilities, foreshadowing their evolution into a cosmic consciousness, a transcendent form of life. Indeed, this is the end of the human species as it was known, as everyone merges into a cosmic intelligence called the Overmind. Now, those familiar with Eastern religions will recognize Clarke's narrative as a clever ET version of pantheistic monism, the view that there's only one kind of ultimate substance. In fact, nearly all New Age spiritualist and occult traditions have comparable monistic dogma. But how many are aware that Pope Benedict XVI, for instance, that his end times views reflected exactly this tone? Now, this might not come as a surprise to those Catholics who are familiar with Father Malachi Martin's warnings in his book, The Jesuits, which documented how priests like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin deeply influenced the Catholic Church and its academia toward occultism this century. In particular, it was his connection with monistic occultism and what's called the Omega Point that started the Rome alien deity rabbit hole. According to Chardin, in his work, The Future of Man, which was written in 1950, the universe is currently evolving towards higher levels of material complexity and consciousness, and ultimately is going to reach its goal, which he called the Omega Point. Chardin postulated that this is the supreme aspiration of complexity and consciousness, an idea also roughly equivalent to the technological singularity for those of you techies out there, nerds alive today, and as expressed in the writings of transhumanists like Ray Kurzweil. In fact, as I've pointed out in a couple of my books on transhumanism, one finds this remarkable coalescence of all non-Christian systems under the banner of singularity, monism, Omega Point, and Overmind. Yet, like the nebulous Christ consciousness that's advocated by occultists, Chardin's writings are easily misunderstood because he not only created new vocabulary for his Darwinian religion, he also redefined biblical terminology to mean something alien to its original intent. For instance, when Chardin writes about Christ, he usually does not mean Jesus of Nazareth. Instead, he's describing the ultra-man, the all-encompassing end of evolution at the Omega Point. I'll give you an example. Consider when Jesus said, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill," Matthew 5:17. Chardin exegetes this as, "I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill evolution." Now, to most Christians, that probably seems overtly heretical, but its infiltration into Roman Catholic thought and the dangerous alien Christ implications it brings with it has infiltrated the highest levels at Rome, including the papacy. Unbeknownst to even most Roman Catholics, Pope Benedict is a Chardinian mystic of the highest order. The Pope's book, Credo for Today, What Christians Believe, which was published in 2009, follows the lead of the Jesuit Chardin and states unequivocally that a belief in creationism, that is, the idea that life and the earth and the universe as we know it, did not evolve, but rather was created by the God of the Bible, quote, contradicts the idea of evolution and is untenable today, end quote. Now, following his rejection of creationism and support for evolution, Pope Benedict uses the doctrine of the second coming of Christ to advance Chardin's Omega point, in which a new kind of God, man, and mind is going to converge. From page 113 of the Pope's book, we read, quote, from this perspective, the belief in the second coming of Jesus Christ and in the consummation of the world in that event could be explained as the conviction that our history is advancing to an omega point, at which it will become finally and unmistakably clear that the element of stability that seems to us to be the supporting ground of reality, so to speak, is not mere unconscious matter. That, on the contrary, the real, firm ground is mind. Mind holds being together, gives it reality, indeed is reality. It is not from below, but from above, that being receives its capacity to subsist. That there is such a thing as this process of complexification of material being through spirit, and from the latter, its concentration into a new kind of unity can already be seen in the remodeling of the world through technology, end quote. The term complexification was coined by Chardin, and the technological illusions it suggests is akin to transhumanism and Ray Kurzweil's singularity. And the Pope's complete devotion to this theology is again laid bare in his book, Principles of Catholic Theology from 1987, which says this, quote, the impetus given by Teilhard de Chardin exerted a wide influence. With daring vision, it incorporated the historical movement of Christianity into the great cosmic process of evolution from Alpha to Omega. Since the new Genesis, since the formation of consciousness is the event by which man became man, this process of evolution has continued to unfold as the building of the new sphere above the biosphere, end quote. This new sphere that the Pope mentions is taken very seriously today in modernist Catholic theology, academia, and even science. It is explained in the science journal Encyclopedia of Paleontology this way, quote, Teilhard coined the concept of noosphere, the new thinking layer, or membrane on the Earth's surface, superposed on the living layer, biosphere, and the lifeless layer of inorganic matter, lithosphere, obeying the law of complexification conscious, the entire universe undergoes a process of convergent integration and tends to a final state of concentration, the point omega, where the noosphere will be intensely unified and will have achieved a hyper-personal organization. Teilhard equates this future hyper-personal physiological organization with an emergent divinity, a future new form of God, end quote. I know it sounds confusing, right? But the newly sanctioned doctrine of an approaching emergent divinity in place of the literal return of Jesus Christ isn't even that much of a secret any longer among Catholic priests, though the cryptic Chardinian lingo does mask it from being uninitiated to broad public comprehension. For instance, in his July 24, 2009 homily in the Cathedral of Aosta, while commenting on Romans 12, 1 through 2, this is what Pope Benedict said, quote, "The role of the priesthood is to consecrate the world so that it may become a living host, a liturgy, so that the liturgy may not be something alongside the reality of the world, but that the world itself shall become a living host, a liturgy. This is also the great vision of Teilhard de Chardin. In the end, we shall receive a true cosmic liturgy where the cosmos becomes a living host," end quote. Folks, this is overtly pantheistic. And of course, the text that he's discussing, Romans 12, actually teaches the exact opposite. Be not conformed to this world, Romans 12:2. So while the Pope therefore aggressively promotes Chardin's process of new Genesis, in which the cosmos comes alive and everyone unifies as a living host, one can readily see that overmind and singularity are roughly equivalent to this monistic concept. Interestingly, New Genesis actually has two uses. One in Chardin's Darwinian pantheism, and another more telling rendering within modern astrobiology. In Chardin's system, New Genesis is the fourth of 5 stages of evolution, representing the emergence and evolution of mind. This is a stage where we are said to be currently. And as New Genesis progresses, so does the formation of the new sphere, which is the collective sphere of human. Though, in fact, many Chardinians believe that the World Wide Web is already an infrastructure of new sphere, an idea that intersects well with transhumanist thought as well. Chardin wrote, quote, "We have as yet no idea of the possible magnitude of noospheric effects. We are confronted with human vibrations resounding by the millions, a whole layer of consciousness exerting simultaneous pressure upon the future and the collected and hoarded produce of 1,000,000 years of thought," end quote. But this concept gets even more translucent in astrobiology, where scientists have adopted New Genesis as the scientific term denoting the origin of technological civilizations capable of communicating with humans and traveling to Earth when they get ready. In other words, the basis for extraterrestrial contact. Consequently, among many, if not most, of Rome's astronomers and theologians, there is the widespread belief that the arrival of these alien overlords, these deities, is going to promote our long-sought spiritual New Genesis. And according to a leading social psychologist, the world's masses are ready now for such a visitation and will receive them or him as Messiah. This is further reflected in a recent United Kingdom poll, which indicated that more people nowadays believe in extraterrestrials than believe in God. Consequently, whether or not it is the ultimate expression, the Nugenic strong delusion is already developing. Now, while I'm not suggesting a direct equivocation per se, the conceptual intersection between the two uses of New Genesis, that is, the occultic and astrobiological, is thought-provoking, especially in light of Clarke's scenario in Childhood's End, where New Genesis is the astrobiological application, the arrival of the fallen overlords, which was the impetus for evolution in the novel toward the overmind and dissolution of humanity. It seems Rome has connected these dots, and they're doing it for us too. They're sowing this line of thinking in public consciousness now. In his sanctioned treatise for the church, Father Kenneth J. Delano linked the concept of maximum consciousness and alien contact, truly new Genesis in both senses of the word, saying this: for man to take his proper place as a citizen of the universe, he must transcend the narrow-mindedness of his earthly provincialism and be prepared to graciously accept the inhabitants of other worlds as equals or even superiors. At this point in human history, our expansion into space is the necessary means by which we are to develop our intellectual faculties to the utmost and perhaps in cooperation with extraterrestrial intelligence, achieve the maximum consciousness, of which St. Thomas Aquinas wrote in Summa Theologica, quote, "This is the earthly goal of man, to evolve his intellectual powers to their fullest, to arrive at the maximum of consciousness, to open the eyes of his understanding upon all things, so that upon the tablet of his soul, the order of the whole universe and all its parts may be enrolled." End quote. Viewed through this lens, the Vatican's promotion of Darwinian and astrobiology intrigues. Following Chardin and Delano, perhaps Pope Benedict, the Vorg astronomers that me and Chris Putnam met with on Mount Graham, and theologians like Tanzelaniti and Balducci pursued astrobiological new Genesis, so that when Petrus Romanus, the final pope, assumed his reign, they might begin ushering in the fifth element of the omega point, known as Christogenesis. In Chardin's book, The Phenomenon of Man, there are 5 elements of evolution. Geogenesis, which is the beginning of the earth. Biogenesis, which is the beginning of life on earth. Anthropogenesis, which is the beginning of humanity. New Genesis, evolutionary consolidation to maximum consciousness, which ultimately leads finally to the 5th, Christogenesis, the creation of a total Christ at the omega point. And isn't it interesting that in the movie, The Fifth Element, it involved a priesthood who protects a mysterious 5th element that turns out to be a messianic human who ultimately combines the power of the other 4 elements, Noon Genesis, to form a divine light that saves mankind. With all of this in mind, be aware, friends, that astrobiology and transhumanist philosophy suggest that this new Genesis is being driven by an external intelligence, they believe, whether it be respectively artificial or extraterrestrial, which leads me to conclude that we are on the cusp of a new Genesis, unlike the one Rome's theologians may have anticipated. I would redefine the terms here and instead suggest aggressive preparation for an anti-Christogenesis, an alien serpent savior, the ultimate Darwinian Ubermensch, who may even bear leathery wings, little horns, and a barbed tail. But regardless how he appears, it is obvious to me that the Vatican has cleverly prepared and is preparing for his coming, perhaps even monitoring his approach from atop Mount Graham using the Lucifer device.